All right, for today's deep dive, we're going to be talking about climate change adaptation, but with a bit of a twist. We're going to be focusing specifically on the relationship between policy and insurance. And we're going to be using Hawaii as our example, specifically Kauai.
I think that's a really interesting choice because islands are like the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to climate change. They really face these threats head on, and their experiences can teach us all a lot about how to adapt no matter where we live.
Exactly. So the paper that we're going to be talking about today is titled Integrating Adaptation to Climate Change Within Risk Management. The case of insurance system signals and policy responses in Hawaii. It's a bit of a dense paper, but trust me, it's got some real gems in there. One thing that really jumped out at me was how, after this devastating hurricane in 1992, Hawaii created a hurricane relief fund. Sounds pretty responsible, right?
You would think so. But the authors uncover something kind of surprising. This fund that was intended to protect homeowners was later rated for things that were completely unrelated to hurricanes, like ending school furlough days.
Wow. Really? That seems like a classic case of climate change adaptation, losing out to more immediate political priorities. It makes you wonder how we can create policies that actually stick, especially when long-term risks clash with these short-term needs.
Yeah, and the paper really digs into that tension. And it gets even more interesting when you consider that homeowners in Hawaii might soon face flood insurance premiums that are 10 times higher than what they pay now.
10 times. That's a massive jump. I can't even imagine what that would do to people's budgets, let alone the housing market.
Right. It's all because of this recent act that's designed to make insurance pricing reflect the true risk of living in a hurricane-prone area. But the authors also point out how Kauai officials feel abandoned by insurance companies when it comes to risk mitigation. Is it all just about profit for these companies? Are they even incentivized to help communities adapt? These are some of the questions we're going to unpack today.
Okay, so for our listeners, our mission in this deep dive is threefold. First, we're going to explore how climate change is impacting these vulnerable islands like Hawaii and why that matters to all of us. Then we'll examine how or if long-term risks are being integrated into local and national policies. And finally, we're going to put insurance under the microscope. Is it a help or a hindrance when it comes to climate change adaptation?
It's a complex web of issues, but the paper does a really good job of laying out the key dynamics. And one thing that really struck me was the way the authors use Kauai's experience with Hurricane Iki back in 1992 to illustrate the vulnerability of islands.
Let's talk about that vulnerability. I know the paper points out something pretty shocking about Hawaii's food security.
Oh, absolutely. It highlights that a whopping 85% of Hawaii's food comes through just one port. Just one. Imagine the chaos if that port was to be damaged or shut down by a hurricane. Suddenly, food security becomes a very real and urgent issue.
It really puts the fragility of our systems into perspective, and Hawaii is already feeling the effects of climate change, right?
Absolutely. Rising temperatures, sea level rise, ocean acidification, changes in rainfall patterns. All of these have very serious consequences for ecosystems, infrastructure, and of course, people's lives.
So with all these risks, it makes sense that insurance would be a critical part of the conversation. But can it actually be a tool for climate change adaptation, or is it just a way to shift the burden of risk?
Yeah, that's where the paper's analysis gets really interesting. It explores this idea of insurance as a potential bridge between risk awareness and action, but it doesn't shy away from the complexities.
Okay. Break down this bridge concept for me. How is insurance supposed to help with climate change adaptation?
Well, the theory is that insurance pricing, when it's done right, can actually incentivize people to reduce their risk. So think about it. If flood insurance is super expensive in high-risk areas, you might think twice about building that, right?
It's like the insurance market is sending a signal, hey, this is a dangerous place to live, so be prepared to pay the price or move to higher ground.
Exactly, and it goes beyond individuals. Accurate insurance pricing can also inform policy decisions. So if governments see patterns of high payouts in certain areas, it signals a need for investment in things like seawalls or relocation programs.
So in theory, insurance could be this really powerful tool that aligns everyone's incentives towards adaptation. But there's got to be a catch, right?
There always is. The paper doesn't sugarcoat the tension between private insurers' profit motives and the need for comprehensive coverage, especially in these high-risk areas.
So are you saying that the places that need insurance the most are also the places that insurers are least likely to cover?
It's a classic dilemma. Private insurers are businesses, so their primary goal is to make money. They are naturally hesitant to offer affordable insurance in places where the risk of massive payouts is high. That's where public insurance programs come in, like the National Flood Insurance Program here in the U.S. It's meant to fill the gap, offering flood insurance in these high-risk areas where private insurers won't tread.
But the NFIP has a bit of a rocky history, doesn't it? I seem to recall something about bankruptcies.
You're remembering correctly. The NFIP has actually gone bankrupt twice after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and then again after Hurricane Ike in 2008. It's a reminder that even public insurance programs struggle with the financial realities of climate change.
What's the solution? How do we create insurance systems that are both financially sound and protect people from climate risks?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one the paper really grapples with. The 2012 Flood Insurance Reform Act, which aimed to make the NFIP more financially stable, is a great example. It tried to phase out subsidies and make premiums reflect true risk.
Which explains why we're seeing those potential tenfold increases in premiums for some homeowners in Hawaii.
Right. But it also raises some huge ethical questions. If people can't afford flood insurance, does that just leave them more vulnerable? And what about those who can't afford to move away from these high-risk areas?
It seems like a classic case of competing priorities, the need for financial stability versus the need to protect people from climate risks.
Exactly. And the paper argues that this tension isn't just about insurance. It's about how climate change adaptation often takes a backseat to other political and economic concerns.
Let's dig into that a little deeper. The paper specifically highlights the struggle to integrate climate change adaptation into policymaking, even in a state as vulnerable as Hawaii, right?
Yes, and that's what makes this research so compelling. The authors don't just focus on the environmental impacts of climate change. They examine how those impacts intersect with political realities, economic pressures, and human behavior.
So what are some of the key obstacles to effective climate change policy in Hawaii? I know we already touched on the Hurricane Relief Fund being rated for other purposes.
Right. That's a prime example of how climate change adaptation often loses out to more immediate needs. The authors also point to these bureaucratic challenges that plague Hawaii's adaptation efforts. Remember that climate change task force that was supposed to coordinate statewide strategies?
Oh yeah, the one that never even met.
Exactly. It's a perfect illustration of how bureaucratic inertia can stall progress, even when the stakes are high. And the paper highlights other challenges, too. The lack of comprehensive loss projections for climate-related hazards, the over-reliance on FEMA for funding at the local level. It's a bit of a tangled web.
So are you saying that even in a state like Hawaii, which is literally on the front lines of climate change adaptation, is getting bogged down by competing priorities, bureaucratic hurdles, and a lack of resources?
That's one of the key arguments the authors make. And they use Kauai as a specific case study to illustrate these complex dynamics.
Okay, let's zoom in on Kauai then. What makes their experience so unique, and what can we learn from it?
Kauai is fascinating because it's a microcosm of the challenges facing island communities worldwide. It's a small island with a limited economy, heavily dependent on tourism and agriculture.
And it's been slammed by hurricanes before.
Right, most notably Hurricane Iniki in 1992. The paper digs into the aftermath of that storm, describing the long and challenging recovery process, the reliance on federal funds for hazard preparedness, and the limited local resources available for adaptation.
It sounds like Kauai is in a tough spot.
Yeah.
Extremely vulnerable to climate change, but lacking the resources to fully address the risks.
That's a good way to put it. And here's where it gets really insightful. The authors quote a Kauai official reflecting on the rebuilding efforts after Iniki. He said, "This was less an insurance problem and more a problem of treating Iniki as a problem that would probably never occur again."
Wow, that's concerning. It's like they learned nothing from that devastating experience.
It's a common problem in climate change adaptation planning. People often focus on the immediate aftermath of a disaster, but fail to incorporate those lessons into long-term strategies.
So it's short-term thinking that's hindering long-term resilience. And it sounds like this lack of foresight is playing out in other ways on Kauai as well.
You're picking up on a key theme here. The paper also highlights the disconnect between Kauai officials and insurance companies. There's this feeling among local officials that insurers aren't truly invested in helping communities mitigate risk.
So back to that tension between profit motives and the need for a more collaborative approach to adaptation, right?
Exactly. And this lack of trust and collaboration makes it even harder for Kauai to effectively address the growing risks of climate change.
Yeah, it really underscores the need for a more holistic approach, one that goes beyond just reacting to disasters and starts to anticipate future risks.
So if we step back for a moment, what are the broader implications of Kauai's experience? What can other communities, especially those on islands, learn from their struggles and successes?
That's a great question, and it's one the authors address directly. They argue that Kauai's story is not unique. It's a cautionary tale that highlights the challenges facing island communities all around the world. These communities are often highly vulnerable to climate change, but they often lack the resources and the political clout to really effectively adapt. It's almost like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're on the front lines of climate change, but they lack the tools to fight back.
Yeah, that's a powerful image. And it raises a really important question. How can we better support these communities? How do we create a system where adaptation isn't just about reacting to disasters, but about proactively reducing risk and building resilience?
Okay, so let's talk solutions.
Yeah,
The paper does offer some potential paths forward, right?
it does. One idea that caught my eye was this concept of using insurance to actually incentivize risk reduction. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth digging a little deeper.
I'm all ears. How do we make insurance work for climate change adaptation instead of against it?
Well, the paper suggests exploring these innovative insurance products that reward people for taking steps to make their homes and communities more resilient. So imagine a policy that gives you a discount on your premium if you elevate your home in a flood zone or install hurricane-resistant windows.
That's brilliant. It aligns the incentives of both the insurer and the insured. The homeowner reduces their risk, which means fewer payouts for the insurance company, and they get rewarded with lower premiums. Everyone wins.
Exactly. It's a win-win. Of course, there are practical challenges to consider. How do you accurately assess and quantify the risk reduction measures taken by individuals? How do you ensure fairness and transparency in setting premiums based on those measures?
Those are good points. It sounds like it would require a lot of data, sophisticated risk modeling, and probably some pretty complex algorithms.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to another key recommendation from the paper: improving data collection and risk modeling. The authors argue that our current risk models, particularly when it comes to climate change, are often inadequate.
And didn't you mention earlier that some insurance companies are actually reluctant to share their data on losses, which further complicates the picture?
Yes, that's a significant obstacle. The paper emphasizes the need for greater transparency and collaboration. We need insurers, scientists, and policymakers all working together to develop more accurate risk assessments and inform smarter adaptation strategies.
It sounds like we need a more holistic and integrated approach to risk management, one that breaks down the silos between government, the insurance industry, and the scientific community.
I couldn't agree more. And this brings us to the role of government. What can governments do to ensure that people have access to affordable and comprehensive insurance coverage in the face of these increasing climate risks?
That's the big question, isn't it? Especially when we consider those potential tenfold increases in flood insurance premiums that we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine how many people could actually afford that.
Yeah, it's a huge dilemma. And the paper doesn't shy away from the tough choices that lie ahead. One key takeaway is that governments have a responsibility to provide a safety net for those who can't afford private insurance.
So are you saying that public insurance programs like the NFIP are still essential even with their flaws?
Absolutely. But the authors caution against simply expanding these programs without addressing their underlying financial and structural issues. We can't just keep throwing money at the problem without fixing the system itself.
So it's not just about providing insurance, it's about addressing the root causes of vulnerability.
Exactly. Governments can play a huge role in reducing risk by investing in things like strengthening infrastructure, improving building codes, and promoting sustainable land use practices.
All of which can help reduce the impacts of climate change and in turn reduce the need for insurance payouts. It's a proactive approach to risk management.
Precisely. And the paper argues that this shift from a reactive to a proactive approach requires a fundamental change in how we think about risk. It's not just about responding to disasters after they happen. It's about anticipating risks and taking steps to mitigate them before they become crises.
It sounds like a pretty monumental shift in thinking. Do you think it's even possible to achieve this kind of transformation, especially when we consider the political realities that we've been discussing?
It's certainly a challenge, but the paper doesn't paint a completely pessimistic picture. The authors believe that change is possible, but it requires leadership, collaboration, and a willingness to embrace long-term thinking.
And what about individuals? What can ordinary people do to become more informed about climate risks and advocate for effective adaptation strategies? I know you posed that question earlier, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such a massive global challenge, but the paper reminds us that individual actions do matter. We can all play a role in building a more resilient future.
Okay, so what are some practical steps that our listeners can take?
Start by educating yourself about the specific risks facing your community. Read local reports, attend community meetings, talk to your neighbors, connect with organizations that are working on climate change adaptation in your area.
Knowledge is power, right?
It truly is. Once you understand the issues, you can become an advocate for change. Contact your elected officials, support policies that promote resilience, and get involved in local initiatives to address climate risks.
So it's about using your voice and your actions to push for a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of everyday choices. Making sustainable choices in your own life, reducing your carbon footprint, conserving water, supporting local businesses, these actions can collectively contribute to a more resilient society.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and we all have a role to play.
That's the key message. Climate change is a global challenge, but it's also a deeply personal one. It's affecting our communities, our families, our lives. And the solutions ultimately lie in our collective ability to act, to adapt, and to create a more sustainable future for all.
Welcome back to our deep dive into climate change adaptation and insurance.
We've covered a lot of ground so far, exploring all these challenges and the potential solutions facing vulnerable island communities like Kauai.
It's been fascinating to unpack these complex issues, and I have to admit I'm feeling a bit of a mix of hope and concern.
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of climate change, but I think it's important to remember that even small actions can make a difference.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most crucial point is that climate change isn't just some distant threat. It's happening right now, and these islands like Hawaii are experiencing the impacts firsthand.
And the paper we've been talking about really highlights how those impacts are being amplified by these unique vulnerabilities of islands, their isolation, limited resources, and dependence on tourism and coastal ecosystems.
Exactly. And all those vulnerabilities just make it even more urgent for islands to prioritize these adaptation strategies.
But as we've learned, adaptation isn't just a one-size-fits-all solution. It requires a real shift in mindset, from just reacting to disasters to proactively managing risk.
It also demands collaboration across all levels of government, the private sector, and communities themselves. We need everyone working together to develop and implement these effective solutions.
We've explored some potential pathways forward. Things like these innovative insurance products that incentivize risk reduction, improving data collection and risk modeling, and investing in things like infrastructure and sustainable land use practices.
We've also talked about the role of governments in providing a safety net for those who just can't afford private insurance and creating policies that promote resilience.
But I think one of the most powerful takeaways for me has been this recognition that climate change adaptation isn't just about science or policy, it's about people.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the human dimensions of risk, the choices that we make, and the values that shape those actions.
We can't just rely on technology or regulations to solve this problem. We need to really engage individuals, empower communities, and foster a sense of shared responsibility for our planet.
The paper's focus on Kauai really drove that point home for me. It's a reminder that climate change isn't some abstract global issue. It's affecting real people in very real ways.
And their experiences offer valuable lessons for all of us, no matter where we live.
The challenges facing Kauai, well, they're a microcosm of the challenges facing communities all over the world. And the solutions that they're exploring, well, those can really provide insights and inspiration for others.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope and a call to action.
I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. Climate change is definitely a daunting challenge, but it's not insurmountable. By working together, we can create a more resilient and sustainable future for ourselves and for generations to come.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into climate change adaptation and insurance in Hawaii. It's been a really enlightening journey, and we hope it's inspired you to keep exploring these critical issues.
And remember, every action counts. Whether it's making sustainable choices in your own life, advocating for these policy changes, or supporting organizations working on the front lines of climate change, we can all be part of the solution.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future for everyone.